Hey everyone, you're listening to Segregated Knowledge. This is our first ever episode, and I have my very good friend Elijah, and we're just going to be talking about what his experience was like in the education system and what he's working towards to make it better. So, Elijah, I'm going to have you introduce yourself. If you could tell us what you're studying in school and what you're currently doing for work.
Hey Vanessa, thanks for the wonderful intro. As she said, I'm Elijah, Elijah Sybblis for full name, and currently I'm studying my Master's of Teaching at the University of Toronto. Um, and in relation to education, I'm looking to become an elementary school teacher. I think it's a great age for like early intervention. I think it's just really important to, really intervene early within the lives of the children because if you don't notice signs that need to be noticed early on, it can be hard to curb that later on. So I'm really excited. I'm in my final semester of the program, and I'm going to be applying to all boards across the GTA, and I'm going to do my best to get things in order wherever I land. So that's just a little bit about me and where I'm going.
I love that. I love Black men taking up space in education. Okay, so I want to dive into what your experience was like navigating the education system when you were in elementary school and high school.
I mean, for starters, my experience, it was hard. I'm just gonna start off by saying that, one thing that really stands out to me is that I remember being inundated with like narratives of a post-racial society. Just to put it into context, like the timeline of my earliest memories in school, like I grew up in the early 2000s. I was born in the 90s, but went to school. Like my school years were in the early 2000s. So that whole idea of like colorblindness and post-racialism, I felt like the teachers didn't use those words obviously to describe it, but I felt as though they were really trying to inculcate those instances within us from a very young age. So, looking back on it, I remember growing up thinking, okay, well, racism is more of a thing of the past. But as I got older, it started with the peer group, like around the time of like grade 5, grade 6, the peer group starts to notice racial differences, and you get teased for it. I've received anti-black hazing a lot growing up, and it got kind of worse after grade 5, I would say. But it just really started to lead me to believe that, what, the things that I was learning like in grade 1 and grade 2 about how Dr. Martin Luther King came and he had a dream and everyone just acquiesced to that dream, and it's like, but it's like, no, it's a lot more complicated than
Mm-hmm.
that. And unfortunately, the whole idea of everybody acquiescing to that dream has been grossly overstated, and there's still like a lot of discord within our society in relation to like race relations and the way in which black people are essentially treated, regardless of country, regardless of continent. It's granted there is obviously different specificities with regards to region, but anti-black racism is one of those things that regardless of region, it's gonna manifest in some way, shape, or form. It just
Mm-hmm.
might look a little bit different.
I actually want to get into something that you said because I want to be cautious of who is viewing our podcast, and if there's a lot of younger people, we're using academic, I like to say, jargon. What is anti-black hazing, and can you talk about an experience if you wouldn't mind?
All right, so anti-black hazing it's to put it in simple words, it's essentially when people have fun uh and make fun of you basically with regards to how you look in relation to your blackness. So it's like if you have like if you have dark skin, if you have a dark skin tone, people will make fun of your dark skin tone. You know, if you're the only kid in the class with black hair, people will make fun of the fact that you have black hair. Or even if they don't make fun of it, they'll be overly compensating of it. And what I mean by that, it's like they'll touch your hair and stuff like, and that was something that happened to me. I used to have right now I'm clean shaven if you will, but I used to have an afro growing up in the school system too. So that was something that I had to face, and I had to like tell people, like, got to a point where I had to yell like, yeah, like don't touch my hair, like, because they think it's like fluffy, but it's like, no,
Mm-hmm.
like I'm not a pet, you know. So
100%.
it just, and it gets really worse. Like sometimes it can get to a point where it can get violent even. You know, there can also be a lot of racial slurs involved as well, and people can refer to you in like various derogatory language. And the derogatory language, the thing about it, like it's specific, like the words that they use are tied to black people, you know, like words like the N word, for instance. I'm just gonna spare everyone from hearing the term right now because I'm trying to be a little more professional for the podcast. But for those who know, they know. And it's like that's something that even if even if people of other races say the word, which I don't recommend, right? Because that's highly inappropriate. But even when people who are not black say the word is still in, because of the etymology or the history of the word itself. It's at a point now where it's intrinsically tied to being a black person,
Mm-hmm.
right? So with that in mind, people are like using that word loosely, and when they're using it to describe you, and especially people who don't really know you that well, and they're not black, but because for instance, I grew up in Scarborough, right? So when people grow up in Scarborough, sometimes they want to feel, and it's not just Scarborough. There's obviously more neighborhoods out there, but Scarborough's one of them where it's like you have some people who just feel like, okay, they grew up in close proximity to some black people, so they just use the word, and then it's like sometimes maybe their personal friend group might give them a pass in the sense of not saying anything to them or not telling them not to say it. But
Mm-hmm.
you can't just go up to every, if you're a non-black person, you can't just go up to every black person and then say that term, because you don't know how it's going to land. So it's very inappropriate. Don't say it. But yeah, non-black hazing, it's just basically like when somebody makes fun of you because you're black,
Yeah.
and they have fun at your expense.
I feel like, so I grew up in like an underprivileged community in London, Ontario, which is like very white. And where I grew up, we had a lot of black people, a lot of Middle Eastern people. And it's funny because how we were treated in school, we brought that back to our community. So you would see other black kids being like, yo, go back to Africa. You're so black. You're like midnight. And it's just like, when I got to an age of understanding what this meant, I was like, whoa, we were as black people contributing in anti-blackness. And you also like, I'm mixed race, so there's like colorism and there's other forces at play when you don't even realize how you're partaking in the system that's meant to oppress you. So just like being aware of how even as black people we're falling into this construction of what other people have created to put us down, and we're being active participants, I think is like really important. That's why I just wanted you to define it for anybody who's listening so that they become aware of how they're partaking in this hegemonic system as well. So your experience wasn't the best growing up in education. So why pursue a career in it?
Well, for me, this is something that was not like preordained or something that I really desired to do from when I was young. I think that really started because it got to a point where when I was in the 12th grade, for instance, I realized, okay, you know what? I've been kind of slacking throughout high school. I've been spending so much time playing like because basketball was a thing for me back in the high school days. And it was just like, I need to get my life together. I need to figure out what I want to do. So towards the end of grade 12, I got my grades up enough to go to college. And the program that I got into, I wasn't sure about at the time. I didn't know if I really wanted to stay, but I just know like one person in my like my mother, for instance, she did a really good job of guiding me and helping me at that time to just be like, you know what, like don't sit around here for a year outside of high school, like just go to school, and
Mm-hmm.
even if you don't like the program, you can still switch and it's not too late, but just go, like, because she didn't want me to linger around too much after high school. So when I was in college, I got into the child and youth worker program at George Brown, and I actually really loved it, and it really it reinstilled the love for like school for me personally. So after that, I decided, you know what, like I did really well in this program, so let me go to Ryerson and just get the undergrad. And of course, that's where in that timeline, I do meet you and many other amazing folks as well. And the Ryerson thing, like it really, I think what really tipped the scales, because initially I did want to, after being a child and youth worker, I was going to get into social work. But what really tipped the scales was just when I was going to Ryerson, it was like the critical analysis in and itself that really made it important, because not only when I was introduced to that concept, not only was I critically analyzing the system around me, but I was also internalizing it and examining like my own experience. And I realized like, yeah, like there was a lot of things that I was missing or just didn't have in school. And that really influenced, how I was very unsure of what I wanted to do. And that's not to say that like school prepares everyone to be sure of what they want to do in life, but it's just one of those things that I think I was at a point where I was way too misguided about the realities of the world, and I was
Mm-hmm.
like, I feel like if I just had somebody, within the school system to really push that on me from a younger age, it would have propelled me forward a lot more. And honestly, if it wasn't for having those supports at home, I feel like my life could have turned out different, because I honestly don't think that I would have went to school after high school, for instance, if it wasn't for my mom just pushing me to do it, and just going through that whole process that I just sort of was explaining there. But and then after, so to make it's like going at Ryerson, doing well there, and just going with the whole idea of critical analysis. It really just helped me decide that, you know what, I want to go into the public school system, and I want to teach social justice. Like I want to teach from a social justice lens and pedagogy, but at the same time, I want to do it in a way that it's not defanged. And what I mean by defanged is that we in the public school system, you will learn about prominent freedom fighters, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak, and social justice individuals, but you learn about them from a standpoint that very much de-radicalizes their views. And I think that creates a lot of misnomers. So you wind up learning about, so like I mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King earlier, and it's like the way I learned about Dr. King in the public school education system, and then what I learned about him just through my own research as an adult, like it's almost like night and day, right? Because the public school system teaches a very specific narrative that just that ironically leads you to believe in color blindness,
Mm-hmm.
like
That's what it, No, sorry.
Yeah.
That's what I would say is like in elementary school, Martin Luther King, who I like adored in elementary school, gave me the impression of like multiculturalism and like existing together. And it was never framed through a black lens. It was just like, this is a black guy fighting for everyone. And I was like, and then when I grew up, I
Yeah.
even have like his books and his articles on my wall. And I'm like, that's not actually what he was all about. So I agree with you. It's very night and day. And
Or
this is what we're getting.
there's one more. Sorry, like there's one more key one that I want to mention because I know my Canadians out here, like everyone's like talking about the whole idea of the Underground Railroad and Canada was the free place. Like soon as the black people came to Canada, like they were good to go and they escaped the clutches of those wretched Americans or something. But it's like no, when they came here, they were still subjugated too. Like, so that part too is something that often got left out, like struggles of African Canadians. And I didn't even know growing up that like Ontario had segregated schools. Like that's something that I figured out in recent years.
Mhm.
And that's pretty sad. Right. So
There
that's just
is
one example.
there is one thing, because this summer you and I were going back and forth, sharing resources and research with each other. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity because you taught me this is about slavery in Canada.
So slavery in Canada, I mean, it is essentially like it is slavery, but the thing about it is the way how it's framed in a lot of cases, it's framed as like indentured servitude or just like being a household servant, right? Like because the reason why they don't frame it, part of the reason why they don't frame it in the same way as they would in like the United States is because Canada is not known for its plantations, So Canada did have plantations, by the way. Like there were a few, but like the thing about it is that if you were to like Google search it, the wording behind it is very tricky. It's very deceptive. Like if you Google search Canadian slavery plantations, it'll just tell you Canada had no large plantations. Now, the operative term there is large. I don't think I really have to specify that too much, but there's that, and then also the other important aspect of it is sometimes they'll try to frame it as though Canada didn't have slavery because there's a whole nother technicality to it in the sense that during the time that Canada had legal slavery, it was still technically a British colony. Like to my understanding, Canadian slavery was abolished in 1834, but that's due to the fact that the British like empire wide, right? Because the British had a vast empire. There used to be a phrase, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," and that's a phrase that's riddled in colonialism because the implication there is that somewhere in the world the British had control over. But
Hmm.
yeah, to stick more to the point of slavery, and it's like in 1834 it was abolished, and then Canada didn't technically become its own country until 1867. So that leaves that gap for people to even argue that well, there's no slavery in Canada, but there was, and there definitely was segregation in Canada too. But even though that history is there, it's still something that seldomly gets spoken about as well.
Hmm.
To be honest, it's one of those things where if the African Canadian community in Nova Scotia wasn't so vocal, I personally believe that we almost wouldn't know about what transpired. Because for instance, what happened in Ontario isn't really as known because the African Canadian community in Ontario is a lot more eclectic in the sense that you've had a lot more mass immigration So a lot of the African Canadians in Ontario, they tend to be like first generation or second generation, and there's a slight disconnect to the era of segregated schools in Ontario because the last segregated school in Ontario was closed in the 1960s, and the last one in Canada was closed in Gaisbury, Nova Scotia in I want to say 1983. So these things are really not that far off here.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we're speaking about history in relative time periods and eras, like but again, these are things that are seldomly spoken about and seldomly known, right? So not have that knowledge and for people to just think that Canada is just this bastion of freedom for everyone is like no, right? And to even add on to it too, like even in the prairie provinces, there was a lot of segregation and maltreatment of early black settlers in the prairie provinces that's not heavily spoken about because a lot of people or a lot of Canadian, like the Canadian government was looking for people to settle the prairie lands for very like cheap or like no cost or little to no cost, right? So they advertised photos like poster prop. They're kind of like propaganda posters, they make they're meant to sell you a dream essentially, but they put together propaganda posters that essentially showcased, hey, come to the prairies, settle. But it's like when they came to the prairies, they were doing a lot of work with like very little compensation, not really allowed to, be involved in like the building processes that went on in the provinces in like a equitable manner. So, you know, even that history is like seldomly spoken about too. So it's very sad, but the point is like there was black people in Canada for a very long time, and it's just hush hush. It
Mm-hmm.
really is.
There, in the beginning, before we hopped into slavery, you were talking about if it wasn't for the support system in your home, you probably wouldn't have taken the path to going into education. So, what resources did you wish you actually had when you were in high school?
I think one resource that I really wish I had personally would be a, a sociology. This might sound a little abnormal, but I'm just gonna say I really wish I had a sociology course,
Hmm.
right? And but not just a sociology course, but like a sociology course that like taught like Black sociology in particular. I think for me, I think I really would have benefited from that because I didn't really understand the nuances of the system at that time. So I wasn't really emboldened with the courage to necessarily cross-examine the various like discrepancies that were happening to me. Like I would almost just view it as normal, which is very weird because when you view somebody's maltreatment of you as like a norm, so to speak, it enables it to just be more like pervasive. And so like I think for me, that one thing what would have helped would be a sociology course. But that, I guess, that's a little more personal, but arguably I think other people would have benefited from it as well. Like another thing that would have really helped too would just be the whole idea of additional academic supports.
Mm-hmm.
And I know teachers, like the generalized consensus about this, unfortunately, is that like teachers can only help so much. But when I say additional academic supports, I feel like the school as a overarching system should really look into the idea of having people who are really adept at a subject uh, come in and teach us outside of school, like outside of your regular 9 to 3 hours, because it's like teachers could teach us from 9 to 3, so to speak, but then, maybe like having an extra 3 hours after school where you rent out certain rooms and students who want that extra academic help can just get it just by virtue of the fact that they attend that school. I think that would have gone a long way as well. Um, Also, too, another thing I think schools have to really do most importantly is from an axiological standpoint, I think they have to start valuing students for who they are and really enticing students to essentially it's like this is a space, not so much that this is a safe, because like safe space, I'm not against the concept, but I also think that if you try to over guarantee a safe space, that can also be harmful because you don't want to mislead somebody in thinking like nothing is 100% safe is what I'm trying
Mm-hmm.
to say. So you want to be careful about how you, of course, you want the space to be safe, but you want to be careful about how much you try to bolster that because you could also create a false sense of security too. But the point is, you really want to make it a space that people feel is vibrant and they really want to come there because it's a vibe. Like I know that sounds vague, but I think most people can agree that the contemporary classrooms, especially in high school, they're very bland and it's just like it's not really inviting. It's just like, okay, this is your classroom. You get your lecture and then you get your homework for the week, and that's like if you do it, you do it. If you don't, you slip through the cracks. Like that's kind of like the high school experience in a nutshell. But I think that there needs to be a serious look into models where in which students can get that extra time in a you know chill space, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And I think it like I'm now coming from like a criminology perspective. But one of the things I looked at and why I started Kids Matter movement was because I realized that that chunk of time after school is where most like petty crime happens with youth, right? Like you have nothing to do between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. by the time you need to go into the house. So where are you going? You're going to the mall, you're going to the movies, you're going to the skate park, the basketball court. Like you're completely right. That 3 hours from 3 to 6 p.m. for kids who need extra help in math, who have immigrant parents, parents who didn't actually graduate high school, who didn't go to college, university, like they can't help you when you're taking grade 11, grade 12 math. The thing I hear the most teachers say is like, if I'm burnt out, how am I supposed to help students in my classroom? And that's real and that's valid. And I do think schools as an institution need to do more to support their students inside. But what does that support look like? And it could just be hosting after school programs that aren't about making crafts and coloring, but actually being productive and teaching students valuable skills that will help them get into college, university, or even just survive outside of school as well.
and I also think too, like having food too, like is also a must in that to in for that model as well, because you can really entice a lot of people to even get it. Like
Mm-hmm.
even it might sound like overly simplistic, but it's like if everyone knows you have free food, like you could even entice people to get into the room for a bit, and that's still better than them just brushing it off in general because it's just like, oh, it's just a homework club or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. On that note, talking about the current education system, we're both not in high school or elementary school, but we're both in fields now of education. So, what advice as a grown Black male would you give to Black males who are in elementary school or high school?
So for elementary school students, like this is very tough because see what I don't want to do, I don't want to just hit them up with like self-corrective behavior in that sense, because one thing I realized it's hard for me to give elementary school children advice. And what I mean by that is like it's almost better if I give the teachers advice,
Hmm.
because for instance, if I'm like hypothetically, what am I gonna do? Tell the children to be like, oh, you know, be careful or watch your tone because your tone's gonna be policed harder. Like it's getting to a point, and again, I understand that many, black parents will unfortunately, still have that talk with their children to be like, don't do or don't get into trouble because you're gonna get into trouble. Like if you get caught, you'll get a more severe consequence, right? But it's just like I'm getting to a point for me where it's like I don't even really want to tell the children so much to be like, hey, watch your tone and stuff like that. Because at the end of the day, all we're really doing when we tell the children that whole idea of watch your tone when their tone isn't even really out of order. It's just more so people trying to assert authority. Then it just creates this situation where they feel this extra pressure that they notice that their other peers don't feel, and it becomes a bit more difficult. So my advice to teachers would be to, do your research, and truly understand which pedagogical frameworks you should implement within your class, whether it's like critical race pedagogy or whether it's culturally responsive pedagogy. Like really actively integrate them within your class and just how you conduct yourself, and really just try to put yourself in another person, in the other child, or in the child's shoes,
Hmm.
and be aware of the implications in what you're saying. Be aware in the implications of the teaching materials that you use, right? Because the teaching materials have explicit and implicit meaning to them. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example to make this a little more tangible. So there was a teacher that I seen. I'm not going to disclose where I seen it, but I know there's a teacher I seen, right? And they had a book, and the book was talking about Crazy Hair Day. But on the cover of the book, it had like a black girl with like afro,
This is triggering
and
for me.
and it's just like and this just it's just I listened to the story. I was there when the story was being read, and I listened to the story, and the story at face value, which presumably a lot of children are like hearing the story at face value. It was a fun, loving story. It was comedic in a way. But me being an adult, I'm looking at the picture and I'm just thinking like, yeah, the fact that you have Crazy Hair Day on the cover with like a black girl with an afro, it basically posits black hair as crazy, or it just essentially suggests that this is something that bears from the normal, strays from the normal. And it's like, even though that's a very subtle thing, that because the class, to put it in perspective, like again, I'm not going to say the exact grade level, because I'm really trying to be as confidential as I can here. But they were in the younger grades. They were primary grade children. So the assumption is that I would assume that most of them maybe didn't pick up on it, but on some level, now if they refer back to that cover of the teacher, if they do something as simple as refer back to the cover of the story that the teacher read to them with regards to Crazy Hair Day, the image is of a black person
Hmm.
with their hair grown out. So
It
what does that promote when they start thinking about black people and black hair, and when they start to process those observable differences as they get older, right? What message is that really sending?
hmm My family tells this story. of me in grade 2. And I went to school and everybody had their hair in like these like actual crazy things. Like one girl is like the character from the Grinch, and just like they had like these wild hairstyles. And I just went with my curly, it was obviously longer because I was in grade 2. I've never cut my hair, just like curly fro. And I won out of all of these kids. And like I got like a Subway gift card. And I remember like going home bawling my eyes out. And my mom's like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, "I won wacky hair day." And my mom's like, "But you didn't participate." And I was like, "I know." But the whole day I had to like fake smile and act like, yay, like I was a part of this, because they like, and I'll like call out my school because I think it was trash. But like I went to Glencairn in London, and they have like an assembly. So like you go on stage, they announce it like on the announcements, this is who won in grade 1, this is who won in grade 2, because like every grade wins. And like that's something now as an adult that like I have carried with me. And my mom will like tell this story of like it as like a funny thing, and it still is just like there's so much rooted in that still just like bothers me as a person. I have a younger sister, Mia, who we like push and like make sure that she loves her curly hair. She knows that like your hair is like powerful, but it's just like those are things I wish I had, because I had to like go through this school like just faking it. And I didn't realize like when I was an adult that I would straighten my hair for interviews because it wasn't like proper. And now I'm like reversing those norms as an adult, which is absurd to me, that hair can be a depiction of what is normal or what is crazy. So I just want to know, is that a story that was recently told to students?
Yeah, it was recent. Trust me, it was recent. I just
For education and building this new system, and like you're saying, debunking colonial ways of teaching, what is your ideal version of education?
I mean, my ideal version of education, okay, to use a specific model, like I like the idea of place-based education. Now, to try to simplify and encapsulate what that is in a short way, essentially like using the outside environment around you to essentially teach the students. So it's like you're going to be integrating aspects of the local community to teach the students a lesson in relation to, you know, social studies, right? 'Cause that's part of like when you think about learning about the communities and what are the different purposes for different parts of the community. If you can use a place-based education model to help foster and facilitate that, like that really helps. It also helps with regards to like learning about different First Nations, because if you have any type of First Nations like reserve like near you, and if you happen to get like the correct permission, and I would also recommend I believe like Native Child and Family Services, they also will, if you reach out to them in advance, they can send like an elder to your classroom to help you like teach that lesson. So it's like if you use a framework where you're going to a place that is reserved for like natives or rather Canadian First Nations, and they're learning about it, they don't just learn to see, like for instance, they don't just learn to see a totem pole
Mm-hmm.
from the lens of like a Hollywood movie, or a Hollywood horror movie. You learn about the spiritual significance behind it, and things of that nature, right? So I think like things like that are very important. To even think about like the Black community, there's so much, it's just like adversarial relationships sometimes where it's like, oh, the community's dangerous, just stay in the classroom, and it's just like always have that jargon or that terminology just being like reinforced about communities and it's dangerous in some cases, like in a lot of cases it could also just be overstatement because some teachers have a fear of walking through certain communities within Toronto just because that they might be from a different area in the GTA that is more affluent, but where they teach is a less affluent area. So they may say like, well, we're never going outside because this is one of the low income areas. So this is one of the priority areas, and it's like if you don't really take them outside and take them through their community, and to some degree, it also teaches them that their community is bad. Like it helps reinforce that. So if you can find unique ways, granted, like obviously you do want to take child safety into account, right? And if you know that if there is like if there is actually a high volume of shootings in your area, then it could be understandable. But there are a lot of areas where it's like the volume of shootings aren't even low, but because the infrastructure of the community might look a certain way, people, in other words, it's like because people might not live in the cookie cutter houses, there's this whole thing of like just stay in the classroom, and just having that as a model, I think would really be my ideal way of teaching. And I also recognize that just being in the classroom all the time can be very taxing. So
Mm-hmm.
I would use a lot. I would integrate outside influences a lot, and I would even try to do that with mathematical concepts. Like even something as simple as if I'm going over the concept of if I'm doing math or science and I'm going over the concept of an arch, you know, just taking them outside quickly to shoot a basketball and have them examine the different. Like I could shoot it in a straight way, and then when they see me shoot it straight, that's one difference I could highlight. And then I can shoot it with the arch, and then they start to get an idea of what an arch looks like as a shape. And it's an interactive way of doing things. So like just little things like that's a very small thing, but if you continue to think on that trail, so to speak, and you continue to expand your views on finding interactive ways to teach, especially when they're younger, because attention spans are short. So it's like teaching it like a lecture is not going to be beneficial. You got to find ways to get them moving and make it hands on. So things like that, that's sort of what I'm trying to learn as I go along. Like I'm not trying to say that I have it all figured out yet because I'm still very much learning. But these are just things that throughout my practicums I've been taking into account. Because one major thing that I will say when I first went into like practicum, and I'm still slightly guilty of doing this within each of my practicums. At the start of my practicum, I will formulate a lesson, and the lecture it'll be like very lecture style, like very much what I'm getting in university. And then it will be like I'll have to re-examine and reframe that and be like, oh, I really made this lesson too much like a university lesson. And then by the end of practicum, or by the middle and towards the end, it's just like I'm teaching much more hands-on stuff. Like, I've got different materials, and I let them choose their materials and really get to like discover and learn, the different ways in which to build a particular object and things of that nature. To me, it really goes a long way. And it's just, those are just like two very different styles, but the difference with regards to engagement is astronomical
Mm-hmm.
because I've been having them sit down, like you literally got like 7 minutes, or 7 to 10 minutes, depending on the age group, but it's just like that's not a whole lot of time. So it really does have to be really quick. And I've been learning that over practice. That's one of the major lessons I've been taking away.
I love that. That's so dope. Even just the engagement, I feel like looking back on my elementary school experience, it was the teachers who were like full of life that did. We went outside for gym classes, or we went outside for our art class. One thing I want to ask you before we go is, what is your mantra that you live by, and what helps you get through day to day, or just get through learning and being a student?
Well, my mantra isn't explicitly connected to education, but it is relatable to education, and I think it is it can be helpful, especially for those who are experiencing bullying. So, without further ado, my mantra is, no matter what somebody else says to you, like their opinion of you can't outweigh your opinion of yourself, right? And again, it's a very simple way of framing things, and to a certain extent is it's slightly oversimplified, but I just feel like the reason why I've developed that way of thinking is because I got to a point in my own life where I started to really cross-examine all of the instances where I was made to feel like less than, right? And through cross-examining those instances, I also was able to cite times where in which I overcame in spite of the narrative. So like whatever narrative was being, or whatever false narrative was being put out there about me, like you can't do this, or you're not going to make it to here, or you're not going to make it to there. I started to really realize, like, you know what, like what I think about myself and how I try to uplift myself, actually, it actually has more power than what other people say. Now, obviously, what other people say is important. Like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not gonna devalue that, right? And I'm not gonna try to downplay the significance of that, because what other people say to you, honestly, that can make the difference between having a deficit lens, having positive self-esteem, or even having an aggrandized sense of self, like the other comments that people say to you. But case in point, it gets to a point where it's like, you get to a point where your discernment starts to become a lot more alert, and you just start to realize, like, yeah, like it's not everything that people say is going to play out in your life just because they said so, and they were trying to demean you. It's like, nah. So to me, that's why I choose to live that way, in that sense. Like, it's not to say that I won't take into account differences of opinion either, but it's also to say that, hey, like, you know there's also a limit to where you have to also realize that if somebody is unfairly criticizing you, and they're doing it to get on your nerves, and they're doing it to try to see you fail, you gotta like brush that dirt off your shoulders. And like, that might, I don't want to sound cruel by saying it, but it's like, it's just more about, sometimes you're in a situation where it's like, you gotta uplift yourself. So if you get to that point where you get resilient in that way, like I promote it in that sense.
I love that. That's so dope. Thank you, Elijah, so much for being a part of our very first ever episode. It's so dope. It was actually, we created it and were inspired through the events that were happening in the summer, and just the lack of information that was taught to us as kids. That's how segregated knowledge came to be. So I thank you for everything that you're doing, and I'm so excited to see what you accomplish in the near future and how you contribute to the education system. Thank you everyone for listening.
All right.
Please. Oh, you go.
I was just gonna say, thanks for having me. Is what I was gonna say too. Sorry.
Please like and subscribe. Also share it with your friends. Comment below what topics you're interested in hearing about in education. And if you're an educator, an artist, a community activist, we would love to have you on the podcast. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.